We continue now at the top of Daf Chaf Beizam and Aleph and Meseches Avodah Zara. This is Avodah Zarah Daf 22a. This Daf is sponsored by David Grossman. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Avodah Daf, see the description box below. And see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought a brisa which said that according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, a person should not rent out his field to a kusi because the kusi is going to do work on Chol HaMoed, and the field is really called by the name of the Jewish owner. It's as if the kusi is a shliach, is an agent of the Jewish owner doing this work on Chol HaMoed. And the Gemara asked that it seems from the brisa that, let's say, to rent it out to a non-Jew, to an Oved Kochavim, that would be fine. And that's, as we said in the previous Amud, because we assume that the Oved Kochavim is actually like an Aris, he's like a sharecropper, and the work he's doing really is for himself. But if that's the case, why don't we apply the same logic to a kusi and say that it would be permitted to rent it out to a kusi? And the Gemara now continues and answers, Arisus Reb Shimon ben Elazar Leslie. Reb Shimon ben Elazar, he doesn't hold of this whole heter that we assume that it's an Arisus, that we assume that it's a situation of sharecropper. And so therefore, what's the explanation of Reb Shimon ben Elazar? Ela Oved Kochavim my time and mutter. Why is it that by an Oved Kochavim, by an idol worshiper, it's mutter to rent out the field to him? The Amrina Levitzai is because we tell him not to do work, let's say on Shabbos, and he's going to listen. But the Gemara says if that's the case, Kusi Nami Amrina Levitzai. The Kusi also, we should just tell him not to work on Chol HaMoed, and he's going to listen. And the Gemara says to that, no, Kusi Lotzai, the Kusi actually is not going to listen. The Amar Anoa Gamir Natfeminach, because the Kusi is going to say, I know more than you, because again, the Kusim, they were a group, they were Samaritans, it was a questionable conversion, and the point over there by the Kusim is that they don't follow all of the Torah properly, and so the Kusi actually won't listen to us when we tell the Kusi not to do work on Chol HaMoed. The Gemara says, Yachi, if so, if that's the case over here, so my area Nikras al Shemo, why is it that Rav Shimon ben Elazar says in the Brisa that the problem with renting it out to the Kusi is that it's called, the field is called by the name of the Jewish owner? We should give a much simpler reason. We should just say that actually the reason is it's lifnei iver, because what's going to happen is you're going to rent it out to the Kusi and he's going to do work that he's not allowed to do. That's a problem of lifnei iver. And the Gemara says, Chada v'yod kamar. Actually, the Brisa is giving one reason, but there is another reason. Chada mishum lifnei iver. Number one, there's the reason of lifnei iver. That is a legitimate concern. V'yod mimnesha nikras al shemo. And furthermore, we have the concern of nikras al shemo. And Rashi explains that Arisus Rav Shimon ben Elazar, Leslie, Rav Shimon ben Elazar is not permitting because of this assumption of Arisus. V'hai denakat kusi, and the reason why Rav Shimon ben Elazar is saying specifically you're not allowed to rent to a kusi. Demashma ha'oved kochavim shari. It sounds like you could rent out the field to an oved kochavim. Lav time mishum Arisus. That has nothing to do with sharecropper. Ela mishum damrinon leilo sasa b'malacha b'Shabbos v'tzayis. Rather, it's because we tell the oved kochavim don't do work on Shabbos, and he will listen. Ihachi, if so, the kusi yasa b'malacha b'chol shel moed. If it's true that again the kusi is going to do this work on Chol HaMoed, so my area the katani gabe kusi v'nei nikras al shemo. If the issue is again the kusi is not going to listen, he's not like the oved kochavim. The kusi is not going to listen, and he's going to do the work on Chol HaMoed. Why give the reason of nikras al shemo that the field is called after the name of the Yisrael? We should say that even if there was no concern about that, there's the issue of lifnei iver. The kusi gerhu, and the kusi is considered to be a ger, he's a convert. Umitzuva ala mitzvahs ki Yisrael, he's commanded on mitzvahs just like a Yisrael. V'lo dami lo oved kochavim ha'osa malacha b'Shabbos. It's not similar to an oved kochavim that's doing work on Shabbos. Shovdei kochavim lo huzra ola, because there is no warning to ovdei kochavim that they can't work on Shabbos. That's why it makes sense that by ovdei kochavim we would talk about a reason like nikras al shemo. But what do you need that for when it comes to a kusi who is a convert, and therefore it should be an issue of lifnei iver? And again, the Gemara said actually there are two reasons. There's the issue of lifnei iver, and there's also the issue of nikras al shemo. And the Gemara continues, Hanu Morikai, there were these Morikai, Rashi explains, Morikai is Zore Ginos Charkom, they would plant gardens of saffron, and this is talking about a situation of a joint venture between an Oved Kochavim, an idol worshiper, and a Jew. And so what happened was, they made the following arrangement. The Oved Kochavim Naked B'Shabbos, so the Oved Kochavim, he would work on Shabbos, the Yisrael B'Chad B'Shabbos, and then the Yisrael, he would do the work on Sunday. Rashi explains, Naked B'Shabbos, Lachrosh, Lizroa, Velixor, he was doing the plowing and the planting and the harvesting. Again, he would do the work on Shabbos, the Oved Kochavim, and the Yisrael would do the work on Sunday. And so the question was whether this arrangement was permitted. Asu Lakame de Rava, they came before Rava, Sharalahu, and he said it was permitted. And so the Gemara continues, Eisvei Ravina l'Rava. Ravina asks Rava a question from the following brisa. Yisrael v'ovid kochavim shekiblu sada b'shutfis. Let's say you have a case of a Yisrael and Ovid kochavim. They receive a field as partners. This is talking about that they're both sharecroppers. Rashi explains, Shekiblu sada ba'risusan mi balabayis. They're sharecroppers from the balabayis. Umi shekiblu. Now, when they accept this arrangement, hutzla al shneim la'asok b'bayachad. Really, the initial understanding is that they're going to work the field together. And so the Brisa says, Lo yomer Yisrael lo ovid kochavim. The Yisrael cannot say to the idol worshiper, Tol chelkecha b'Shabbos, you take your portion on Shabbos, va'ani b'chol, and I'll take my portion for the weekday. That you can't do. However, says the Brisa, V'im hisnu mitchila, but if they stipulate that from the outset, then mutter, that it is permitted. V'im bo l'cheshbon, but if they make a calculation, asr, then it is forbidden. And Rashi explains, Lo yomer Yisrael tol alta chelkecha b'Shabbos. The Yisrael can't say to the non-Jew, to the idol worshiper, you take your portion on Shabbos, meaning lefisha nasa shlucho al chatzi hayom hamutal olav. Essentially, what then is happening is that really the Jew has to work together with the Ovid Kochavim on Shabbos, but the Jew is saying to the Ovid Kochavim, you know what? You be my agent for the half of the work that I'm supposed to do on Shabbos. That's already a problem. That's similar to Nikras al Shemo. V'im hisnu mitchila, but if that's the condition from the outset, kodem shhut la'olav, meaning the Jew never had responsibility on Shabbos, they just stipulated that the Shabbos is entirely the responsibility of the Ovid Kochavims, then mutter, then it's going to be okay. To halokibul ala Yisrael avoda de Shabbos, because the Jew never accepted work on Shabbos, ve'ena Ovid Kochavim shlucho, and so therefore the Ovid Kochavim is not considered to be his agent. And finally, the Brisa said, v'im bo lecheshbon, let's say they do a calculation, and Rashi explains, lava hisnu mitchila kai. This is not going on the fact that they made this stipulation from the outset. That's not what's going on in this last line. Ela milsa bi'an veinafshi, this is its own statement. Kolomar, it means to say as follows. Im kiblu stam, let's say what they did was they just received the field as sharecroppers with no specific arrangements, which means essentially the assumption is they're both working together the entire time. V'yasu stam, and then they go ahead and they work. V'ayil ha'ovid kochavim b'Shabbos, v'Yisrael b'chol. Now they don't make an arrangement, but it happens to be the Ovid Kochavim goes on Shabbos and does some work, and the Yisrael does the work on the chol on the weekday. V'lo tzivo Yisrael, there was no instruction by the Yisrael. Ubo l'cheshbon le'achar zman, and then they're going to calculate after this whole thing is over. Lomar kama yemei Shabbos natal ta'atov ani etol kenegdon yemei achol. They want to do a calculation. How much days of Shabbos did you work? And then I'll take a corresponding number of days of chol. So they're already also, that's going to be forbidden. Tischar Shabbos unotel, because then really he is taking pay for the work that was done on Shabbos. The goli daita the Ovid Kochavim shluch haya. He's essentially revealing that the Ovid Kochavim was his agent. That's why it's a problem if it's bo l'cheshbon. And so in any case, it seems from this brisa that unless there's a stipulation from the outset, this is problematic because the Ovid Kochavim is considered to be a shliach of the Yisrael. And so the Gemara says, ichsif, the Gemara says he was embarrassed, meaning Rava was embarrassed because he just permitted it. And the Gemara then continues, l'sofik loy milsa, but in the end it was revealed, the hisnu mei karahava, that actually in the case of Rava, they had made a stipulation at the outset, and so that the brisa said was permitted, and it was not a problem. And the Gemara continues, Rav Gavia mi Bei Kasil Amar, Rav Gavia from Bei Kasil, he says, and Rashi explains, Rav Gavia mi Bei Kasil Amar, Lav Hachi Hava Uvda. Actually, that wasn't even the case. You don't have the particulars of the case correct. The case actually was as follows. Hanu Shasile de Arla Hava. The case involves saplings of Arla the first 3 years. You're not allowed to get benefit from the fruits of the tree. And that was the situation. And Ovid Kochavim Achel Shnei de Arla. And the Ovid Kochavim, he was going to consume the fruit the years of Arla. V'Yisrael Shnei Dateir. And then the Yisrael was going to consume the fruit the years where it was permitted for the Yisrael, and that was the arrangement. And so Asu L'Kamei de Rava, so then they came before Rava to ask if that was permitted, and Sharalu, and he permitted it. That actually was the case. And Rashi explains, Ela Shasile de Arla Hava, the case was Shasile de Arla, Yisrael v'Ovid Kochavim Kiblu Sada B'Shutfis, the Yisrael, the Ovid Kochavim, they had a partnership in a field, V'Nota V'Yitlo Hachatzi Ben Shneim, again they're planting it, they're dividing it, V'Nisazik Ovid Kochavim called Sarcho Shnei Arla V'Achlan, the Ovid Kochavim, he worked all the years of Arla, he consumed the fruit, V'Yisrael Kibel Gimel Shana Macheres Kenegdon V'Achlan, then the Jew had 3 years after that, and correspondingly, he consumed the fruit in those years. And so the question is that permitted? And so Sharalu, so again, Rava permitted it for them. The heter gomer have it, that's totally mutter. To avagav de kiblu yachad lechatchil, in that case, even though they accepted it together, v'yamar lo Yisrael hayayata ovid begimel shanim halalu v'ani gimel achareim, and the Yisrael said, you work these 3 years, I'll work the 3 years after. Ein kanes or shlichus, that's not a problem realm of agency. It's not forbidden because of agency. Because first of all, the Yisrael is allowed to work the field. There's no prohibition of working the field during the years of Arla. It's just consuming the fruit. Now, if you're going to say it's a problem because the Yisrael is taking the fruit the years after Arla, corresponding to what the non-Jew took during the years of Arla, and then it comes out that he's getting benefit from the fruits of Arla, shemacharan, because he's essentially selling them. That actually is not considered benefiting from the fruits of Arla. Shekein hamishpah, because that's how they set it up. Shana shezeh oved hu ochel. The rule simply is the year that you work, that's the year that you eat those particular fruits. But the Gemara continues and asks, "V'ha'osvei Ravina l'Rava." But how could this be the true version of the story? But didn't Ravina ask Rava a question from the Brisa above, and that would have no relevance? It would not be a question against Arla, as Rashi just explained. And the Gemara says to that, "L'siyuei Saya." Actually, that Brisa was being brought as a support. We'll see Rashi in a moment. The Gemara says, "1 second, va'ichtsef." But it wasn't the story that he was embarrassed when he heard the Brisa. So how could it be that the Brisa supported him? And to that, the Gemara says, "Lo hayu dvar me'olam." That never happened. He was never embarrassed. And Rashi explains, Osvei Ravina, didn't Ravina ask a question on Rava from a Brisa of him came might to Yufto? If so, what's the refutation? Gabe Shabbos Isser Shlichus b'Malacha. Again, by Shabbos there's an Isser because there's agency over here in terms of the work. Masha Ein Kain Barla, that's not true by Arla. And the Gemara says no. The Siyui Sai, actually the Brisa was a support for Rava. Miniktani Hisnu Lechatchila Mutter, because from the fact that in the Brisa it says if they stipulated at the outset, so there's no agency, so it's mutter. So Alma Kileka Isser Shlichus b'Malacha Shari. So you see that if there's no prohibition in terms of agency, then it's permitted. Even though the Yisrael gets some benefit, and the same would be true by Arla, and so that's why it actually is a support for Rava. And the Gemara continues, the following question, Stama Mai, what if there were no arrangements whatsoever? Rashi explains, Stama Mai, Shekiblu Stam, they just received the field with no arrangement. V'yasu Stam, and they did it naturally. Oved Kochavim b'Shabbos, the Oved Kochavim did the work on Shabbos. V'Yisrael b'Chad b'Shabbos, the Jew did the work on Sunday. V'lo Amar Yisrael me'olam, the Jew never made any such statement of Tola Toas HaShabbos, that you take Shabbos, Vani b'Chol, and I'll take the weekday. So Ma'u Lachluk Stam b'Shavik, and they simply divide up evenly. V'lo Yisrael as Shabbos, the Jew simply won't mention anything about Shabbos. What would happen in that situation? That's the question of the Gemara. And the Gemara says, Tashma, come here, a proof from the above Brisa, Im Hisnu Mitchila Mutter. It said, if they made the condition from the outset, then it's Mutter. So Hastama Asr, that sounds like if they did nothing, then it would be forbidden. But the Gemara says, no, Ema Seifa, let's look at the end of the Brisa. Im Bo Lecheshben, if later they do the calculation Asr, then it's forbidden. Hastama Mutter, that sounds like if they just do everything Stam with they have no explanation, no details in terms of their arrangement whatsoever, then it actually would be mutter. And so the Gemara says, rather, you can't really derive anything from the Brisa in a situation where they had no discussion about the particulars of the arrangement. Rashi explains, Imbo lecheshben, again, cheshben means, Hizkir lo Yisrael shal Shabbos b'osach haluka, that the Jew mentions the fact when they're dividing up, when they're making that division at the end, he mentions that they're dividing Shabbos corresponding to a weekday, v'goli daite d'shluchihu, then he's showing that this non-Jew was actually his agent. Hastama, so that would imply that again, if there was no arrangement whatsoever, the af b'shas chalukah stam mutter, that if again at the time of the division they don't actually say anything, they just divide, then it would be mutter. So again, you have conflicting inferences from the Brisa, and therefore the Gemara says you cannot make any determination as to the answer to this question from the Brisa. Hadran aloch lifnei edein, we will return to you parak lifnei edehen. This is the end of the first parak of Meseches Avodah Zara. If you're enjoying these videos and this channel, please like, share, and subscribe, and take a look at the description box below to see how you can support this channel. And we will now begin the second parak of Meseches Avodah Zara with the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ein ma'amidin behema, you're not allowed to stand up an animal b'pundakos shel ovdei kochavim. You can't leave an animal in the inns of the ovdei kochavim, of the idol worshippers, mimnei shechashudan ala ravia, because they're suspect on bestiality. This was quoted earlier. V'lo tesiyached isha imayin, also a woman should not be alone with them, mimnei shechashudan ala harayos, because there's a concern for harayos, for illicit relationships. V'lo yisiyached adam imayin, and a person should not be alone with them, mimnei shechashudan al shvichas damim, because there's a concern of murder. Rashi explains, Ein ma'amidin behema b'pundakos sha'osin le'esachsein over derachim sham. These are inns for the travelers. U'malim schar l'bailim, they pay a fee, they pay a certain fee in order to stay at the inn. Shechashudan al haraviyah, because there's a concern of bestiality. And Rashi says, Uvnei Noach nesruba, and Bnei Noach, it's forbidden bestiality. Techsiv, because it's written in the pasuk, V'hayu l'basar echad, they'll be as one flesh, meaning to say again, man and woman. Yatsu behema chaya va'of, that comes to exclude animals, and that's not considered to be basar echad. wood. V'yesh kan lifnei iver lo sitin michshel. That's considered to be lifnei iver because now you're putting a stumbling block in front of the blind because this is something that a ben Noach is warned about, and now you're putting this animal over here. That would be like a stumbling block in front of the ben Noach. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chav Beis Amud Beis.